Hi, I'm David Safin, Associate Professor of Digital Art and Media here at St. Vincent. This is my office, and these are my office hours. As you know, the point of our little show here is to introduce you to creative talent and to show you some of their work. Today, my guest, Ben Wagner, is visiting us from New York. I have that right? You're in New York right now?
Update, Wilmington, Delaware.
Wilmington, Delaware. Oh, wow. So breaking news on our show here. And it's also interesting for me because this show is usually filmmakers specific, and you're a filmmaker, but I see your website calls you a musician, a podcaster, an author. I would add raconteur. I just learned what that means. So we're really glad to have you here. And even though that you're now in Delaware, I do think that your work has kind of a heart and a spirit that has a home here in Latrobe because of where your inspiration comes. So again, thank you for joining us today, Ben.
Oh, 100%. And likewise. I hope that's
all right. So for our audience, can you give a little of your background, who you are, what you've done, and what you're doing today?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm born and raised in the Midwest and Northeast, originally Iowa, hopped around quite a bit, as you may recall, and as you see in the second film, Friends and Neighbors. Spent 25 years in New York City at MTV News, Rolling Stone, and Facebook, Instagram. And just prior to the pandemic in 2019, my wife and I moved our two daughters to my wife's hometown of Wilmington, Delaware. I commuted and kept sort of a double life or quadruple life between New York, Wilmington, and kind of globetrotting for Facebook, Jakarta, Manila, Sydney, Singapore, all over the place, which, as you know from having watched the second film, came with a pretty high tax. And finally left Facebook in the spring of 2021, hung my consulting and coaching shingle. So primarily my work nowadays is coaching and consulting media and tech organizations, startups, both individuals, institutions, and teams from right here in Wilmington, and going wherever is necessary to do so.
So I think back to when we met. I don't know if I remember the year, 2010, 2009. It was a while ago that we physically met. We haven't actually been face-to-face physically since then, but I'm glad that I'm able to talk to you, at least in this forum. But we met here at the St. Vincent at the Fred Rogers Center, which is now the Fred Rogers Institute. When you were you still working on your first film with your brother, or was it done?
I think it was done. I came to Latrobe 3 times, if memory serves, first to shoot. And this is at a time when much of the, if you'll beg the expression, infrastructure that now exists around Fred's legacy wasn't present. This is probably 2006, 7, 8 when we were shooting. And the second time was when we were done, and I think I came to the archives first, and we got sort of all access, and Max King was just a delightful host, and we had dinner with David Newell and Joanne. It's possible that, no, because I came back to your classroom then separately, because that was just me. My brother wasn't with me. So 3 times. And so I think the third time was we got to screen a few times, and I have a photo in my mind of me with your class.
That photo's in we have a little bulletin board outside. That photo is in our hallway. So it lives on. If I find a digital copy, I'll make sure I can share it with you. So how is your brother? You still working with your brother? How's he doing?
Yeah. Chris is great. We spoke yesterday. We're still working on Friends and Neighbors. I mean, I always say to people, I'm a little like Kanye West. It's not done until somebody sort of takes the master out of your hands. So we're working on a 56-minute version, right? The sort of theatrical version is about 73, and broadcast, specifically PBS, with whom we hope this one will find a home. Not quite there yet, knocking on wood. Needs a 56-minute version. So we were talking about that yesterday, and talking about our family and catching up on all the things. I saw him a couple weeks ago at the beach. We talk all the time. And we've talked about all these topics all the time. In fact, in a lot of ways, and we'll get to it, but Friends and Neighbors is born of that kind of ongoing conversation. And a lot of the elements of the movie, even though we produced this one a little differently, are born of his and my ongoing conversations, increasingly on the telephone, because he's now in Connecticut. We both are no longer New Yorkers. We both work with institutions and organizations in New York, but we're not there anymore. Thank goodness.
It does seem like you're eventually going to just find your way to where he is if you just keep moving. But
I hope it's evident to you, and it may not be, but I can feel the experience of being sort of my own experience in my body, and blood pressure and sort of like temperament and pacing is down like 5 notches from 5 years ago, and from when I saw you in Let's Europe a decade or so ago. That is the upside of leaving the town and doing some of the due diligence that you've seen in the movie, I hope.
Well, we're glad that your blood pressure is down.
Yeah, me too.
All right. So as I mentioned in our introduction here, we got to know each other based around a film you made called Mr. Rogers and Me. And so just in case any members of our audience hasn't seen it, I think now would be a good time to show the trailer. Okay, so let's just check that out.
Mr. Rogers summered in a modest gray clapboard house on the edge of Nantucket Island. My family rented a tiny cottage next door. On the afternoon of my 30th birthday, Mr. Rogers asked me about my job as an MTV producer. Moments later, the man with the longest-running public television program in history said to me, "I feel so strongly that deep and simple is far more essential than shallow and complex." The conversation haunted me for years, and though Mr. Rogers wasn't around to tell me in his own words, I wondered, who was he really, and what did he mean by deep and simple? And so I left my Times Square office and sought out the neighbors that knew and loved him best.
Mr. Rogers was a unique human being, forever giving, forever teaching, forever nurturing, forever taking advantage of every moment to tell people that it is important that we respect one another and love one another. What a lasting legacy.
He would walk into a room, an atmosphere where there were children, but not only children, because adults reacted this way to him as well. And the electricity, the molecules changed in the air. You felt that you were in the presence of this figure.
He used his life so well and so wisely, and he used his time on earth to do so much good. It was just what he was here to do. And he did it so effortlessly.
He assumed that everyone watching him had inside themselves this wonderful person that was just dying to get out. And he was going to open the door for you. And then help you open the door for others. That's pretty simple, and that's pretty deep.
Mr. Rogers touched millions of lives. This is the story of Mr. Rogers and me.
All right, welcome back. We just saw the trailer for Mr. Rogers and Me. And I just wanted to ask you, Ben, after that was done, after you kind of washed ashore of the editing and the completion and exhibition, what was the response? What was the response from your friends, your colleagues, and the community of Fred Rogers?
Oh, I mean, we were spoiled. I mean, and I think we knew well enough with our subject matter. And bear in mind, this is pre any of the other documentary about Mr. Rogers or the Tom Hanks movie. But I mean, it's a documentary about Mr. Rogers. So it was universally appreciated and loved. And it was just like a warm embrace, it was fantastic. It did come in waves. We had no idea what we were going to do with it. You may recall, we made it because we thought it was important to be made at a time when it wasn't entirely clear how his legacy would be preserved. This is, again, pretty much of the infrastructure that now exists, and certainly some of the other documentary and filmmaking efforts. So we made the movie and showed it to our friends and family, and that was kind of it for a second. And for a couple months, that was fine. And then I, through a mutual friend, was email introduced to a woman at PBS who I later met at South by Southwest, and we had breakfast, and over at Eggs Benedict, shook hands, and it was a thing. And a year and a half later, we did a larger rollout with screenings at the Paley Center on both coasts, and then the premiere on PBS. We got a Sunday New York Times article, which for a kid from Iowa was about as great as it gets. So it was terrific. I mean, it was a massively good feeling. But it's interesting to note, since we're going to move to friends and neighbors in a second, it was also about as much stress as I'd ever experienced. Because if you're paying attention to the movie, I'm actually asking hard questions about, like, basically what constitutes substantive media, substantive lives within MTV while I'm at MTV. This is 2010 to 12 when we first premiered to its premiere on PBS. I was at MTV News until 2014. I premiered it in the Paramount screening room for my colleagues on Viacom's dime. So, like, it was also super stressful. I remember coming home from a week of massive press, all positive, and collapsing. To be fair, this is going straight off the red eye from LA, doing a news hit at New York One, and then coming home, to my wife and falling into her lap and sobbing. And so it's so interesting that even something that was so positive was also fraught, and I think that's an important lesson. It's not all plumes and accolades and trophies and good vibes. Like, it also was really hard because I ran myself as hard as I could to get it seen by as many folks as it could be. And then it has this great long tail. It aired for years as part of PBS's. Each local station would make choices how and when and where to screen it. And many of them used it as a fundraising lever for years, which is like a double win as far as I'm concerned, because you're preserving the legacy of, or helping to preserve the legacy of, the individual, but you're also helping to preserve the longevity of a pretty important, I think, media platform. So it was fantastic. It ended up being seen in something like 70% of channels, PBS channels. Downloaded hundreds of thousands of times. It's still available. They relicensed it from us, and we had no idea what we were going to do with it, man. So, like, pretty cool outcome for just a couple of brothers who were like, we have to do this and we'll figure the rest out, which is kind of my operating principle, for better or worse.
So you'd mentioned, that it's still going. It has that long tail. If anybody watching us right now wanted to check it out, how would they do that?
Well, there's a bunch of ways. The easiest is go to mrrogersandme.com, which is like it sounds, MISTER, rogersandme.com. Go to pbsvideo.com. It's on Amazon and Apple for rent. So it's pretty easy to find if you Google it. It's MISTER, rogersandme.com. You'll find it, and it's I think like 99 cents, because I'm always advocating for it to be as low a barrier of entry as possible, so as many people can see it as possible.
And I remember two parts of the rollout. One was your premiere here on campus, where we hosted members of the community at large, Latrobe, but also students, and got to do a Q&A with you. And then I remember it being on WQED, the Pittsburgh affiliate of PBS, and feeling proud of myself when it was on TV. I was like, I saw that before it was released. I know that guy. He came to my class. I was very proud of myself to be in a wide circle of your distribution.
Yeah, man. No, I would go a step further and call you an sort of early advocate, because you just, like, life is community building and finding your neighbors. And that's kind of what I was trying to do with the second movie, which is like, I don't know, maybe that was the beginning of it, because it was very grassroots at first, right? At some point we hired a publicity firm who, by the way, did it for next to nothing because they believed in the values and the purpose, but it's very much like, looking for the helpers. I just didn't quite have all the language that I've gained in the intervening decade because I've been talking about it. But yeah, man, you're an early helper for sure.
Well, I appreciate that. I take that as a compliment. One of the reasons why I show your documentary to my documentary class, which I'll be offering this fall, is content. Obviously, I think it's an important story and narrative that you're sharing, but also form. The way you make your films is very much a self-reflexive style that I think is very modern and is really kind of taking off in that sort of vlog space where you're not just making a film, you're telling us in the film how and why you're making it. And I like to empower students to do that themselves. Tell a story that is yours, but also tell us why it's important to you, to give it that real sense of authenticity. So I think that's a good place to maybe go into your next film. You go through, again, you wash ashore, you're collapsing into your wife's arms, the movie's done, and now you're doing it again with friends and neighbors. So how do you feel that your first experience was a springboard into this second one?
Oh man, we couldn't possibly in the remaining time that we have, so I'll do my best. But in essence, I spent another decade living and working in New York City and kind of frying pan to fired it. I was senior vice president at MTV News, back and forth to and from LA to New York, working at the highest levels, raising 2 toddlers, doing everything I could to keep my head above water. And I was semi-aware of the fact that I was doing my best, but it was really high stakes and very challenging. But I don't think I knew the degree to which I was under a lot of duress. And so it wasn't until like 2017 or so just prior to COVID. At this point, I'm working at Facebook. One of the products I was working on blew up in my/our face. There's a product called Trending. There was bias. There were allegations of systemic bias within the product. It wasn't true, as I say in the documentary, but it didn't matter because sometimes what is the story that is told is what matters. And anyway, it's not the point. The point is it was terrifying because nobody wants to be involved with something that's front page news, right? And then I got tossed from that gig, which was very much New York based, into a global gig where I was traveling the world and basically being the human being to introduce Facebook as a company and an organization to journalists and leaders, journalism leaders all around the world, which was amazing. But if I've learned anything in the last few years, it's how important sleep is and circadian rhythm and sort of being connected to nature. And guess what? Flying all over the world doesn't allow, right? We could just start there. So when COVID struck and none of us could go anywhere and I was locked down in a new town with a new job, a couple of kids who I adored and I was afraid were gonna, like I think most of us, I was like, oh gosh, my only job here is to protect them, but I don't know what's happening. Like I kind of hit a wall and I didn't know it quite at the time. But I was coping with some fairly unhealthy choices, like a lot of us, drinking more than I wanted to. And I just kind of hit as I'm calling, I'm working on a book, like it was a slow motion breakdown. It wasn't like I didn't hit a wall, I didn't crash a car, I didn't get arrested, I didn't get divorced, everything was all good in those metrics, but it was, I was in a dark spot and a lot of us were. And once that data started coming out around our collective mental health, I was like, oh, this isn't just me. And I had this conversation to celebrate the anniversary of Mr. Rogers' Me with Tim Madigan and Amy Hollingsworth and my brother around this podcast I was doing called Friends and Neighbors. And in that discussion, we just touched on some of these points, Tim and Amy in particular, that kind of catalyzed this thought that, oh, there is a straight line from Mr. Rogers and me to what I'm experiencing right now in a couple of ways. One, Fred said in 1967 to Congress, if we can just help people understand that what's mentionable is manageable, we'll have done a terrific service for mental health. That's the end of his pitch to Senator Pistoria, Pennsylvania senator, who was granting or not granting the $20 million, right? And I had clipped the little bit about mental health out of the first movie. It's in our first movie because I said to Chris, I don't think this is a movie about mental health. I think this is a movie about media. But I see the clip again, a decade later, and I go, oh my gosh, this is what Fred was telling us all along. This is about regulation, which is understanding how our nervous system works and what it's like to be in the world when you're a little kid and you're overwhelmed. How do you get yourself grounded? How do you breathe? How do you understand these basics about being a human being, which Fred was not only an expert at, but surrounded himself with experts and modeled it all the time. So I pretty rapidly saw the connection between what I think was at the foundation of what Fred was doing decades before the Surgeon General said, hey, we're in trouble here with social media, with mental health, with isolation, right? And it was like a boom, and I kind of knew, working with Chris on the podcast, I said to him at one point, if we just string a couple of these interviews together, we'll have a documentary. And of course, Chris was like, no, it's never that easy. And he's always right, by the way, when it comes to the production part of it. But then I got diagnosed with PTSD. I went to a therapist and gave him sort of the rundown of what had happened in my childhood as well as my career. And he just said, like, super matter of fact, very low key, well, it sounds like pretty reasonable. The coping I was doing sounds pretty reasonable given the amount of post-traumatic stress. It sounds like you're managing. And I went, what? Like, first line responder, frontline responder. I'm not a soldier. Like, it didn't even occur to me that that was applicable to average citizens. And then, I just do a little bit of reading, Bessel van der Kolk's Body Keeps a Score, and some other stuff. And you realize that there's this bell curve, right? And we know about the front of the bell curve. We know about the really headline grabbing stories or the sort of memoirs that break through in culture. But it ends up, there's this, and there's an emerging body of evidence-based information around the fact that trauma and the impact of trauma is way pervasive. 70% of Americans experience at least one, right? And when you look at adverse childhood experiences, trauma that occurs between 0 and 18, it has a huge correlation to what happens to us as adults. And I just learned a little bit, and I was like, oh my God, Fred was on this from the start. And that became, Friends and Neighbors.
I really appreciate and admire just how your films are just a segment of your life. You know what I mean? It's just like you're living your film, and what you learn and experience in your film is built on your life, but you also want to bring people into it and to let people know, if you're feeling this way, here's what you can do. And again, I think it's a very modern way, via YouTube, via podcasts, via your website, that it's just about where are the people, where do they need to hear this? And so I think that's just a really good way to produce.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it, and it is. I have an awareness of it as a choice, right? And I certainly had an awareness of it in the choice of how to make Friends and Neighbors, because the first one I kind of did the only way I knew how, and then I thought, well, in a lot of ways, this is a double click into Mr. Rogers and me. There's a little bit about my parents' divorce, and in fact, what connected me so deeply to Fred, I know now in a way that I didn't know then, and know now more than ever, was how he modeled regulation with me in Nantucket when I met him. He was super present, hyper mindful, very self-regulated, which means very present, aware of his breath, aware of his listening pattern or sort of engagement with me, right? Mindful of what my needs were, like just, total best practice stuff. So the other thing about the storytelling, just to I think to put a fine point on it, is like, I was born at a time when, I just happened to be at the right intersection where it became clear to me I was an early internet guy, right? Like, I had a modem when I moved to New York in 1995, and I had a Mac, and I knew how to use both. And I had a brother who was a couple years ahead because he was editing on Avid before everybody else. And I loved stories and reading. And I read tons, the Village Voice, Rolling Stone. I read a ton, including, Rolling Stone did a lot of first person stuff, right? And I started blogging early as a way to hook people into coming to hear my music, writing in the first person, assuming that if people gained some insight into the songwriting process or the marketing process or what it was like to be me on the day-to-day, that might increase their likelihood of coming to one of my shows. So it's like super organic. At the same time, and I don't want to overly reveal ahead of time, but like, I got a nod. I worked at video store as a kid, and one of the movies that really shook me by the lapels was Roger and Me, which is in essence the form that we're talking about, and maybe one of the first. I'm sure you know better as a professor of this work, but certainly one of the first mainstream examples of that kind of first person kind of gonzo. He was a little more gonzo than I am, right? But and that's obviously where I swipe the title, right? That's like, it's a little tip of the cap. In fact, I've never reached out to Mr. Moore. I probably should, and acknowledge that or thank him. My brother's worked with him. He shot a video for him. But
Oh, wow.
anyway, so there is both there is a little bit of a historical context there and a personal context there. But in a lot of ways, I feel like if you can hook people with your story, you're a proxy for them anyway. Like, that's the exchange with a screen, right? Particularly if you're in a theater and you get to like crowd out all the other noise and culture and you're just watching the screen. It's like, you are Iron Man, right? You are Bilbo Baggins. You are John Wayne, right? And that's the beauty of that experience. And some of the tricks, some of the problem, if you're TikToking and you're doing a zillion 10-second car crashes every night before bed, right? But we'll put that aside for another call.
All right, so we've heard a lot about Friends and Neighbors. So in order to give our audience a better understanding of what it is, why don't we check out the trailer for that? So let's just give that a roll.
From our schools
Up to 14 could be dead.
to our capital, our grocery stores, highways, and homes.
3 children have been shot.
Americans are anxious, angry, scared, and confused.
Everything from the rising incidences on airplanes of people acting out to an insurrection. Those are manifestations of unaddressed trauma.
In the new documentary from the brothers who brought you Mr. Rogers and Me, we examine how trauma, stress, and oppressive thinking maladapt our nervous systems, contribute to shallow and complex lives, and drive poor health outcomes in so many of our friends and neighbors. And we, as Fred Rogers so often encouraged us, look for the helpers in post-pandemic America, the people who are healing the anxious and uncertain communities around them.
Everybody has trauma, like in some form or fashion.
Trauma is not about what's wrong with you, it's about what happened to you.
Every time a young person is shot, that's a family that's affected, that's a community that's rocked.
If we do not have recognition of the ills of the past, then we are going to repeat them.
We have to become an America that we have never been. And we have to become so profoundly altered in what we become that we can never again be.
Being willing to be vulnerable and to be vulnerable openly, it has a transformational impact, not just for ourselves, but for each other.
And I feel that if we can only make it clear that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we will have done a great service for mental health.
What's mentionable is manageable. And when you look for the helpers, you know that there's hope.
All right, so we just saw the trailer for Friends and Neighbors, and I have so many questions and thoughts for you about it. My first thought, having experienced these and the audience experiencing the trailers, is, talking about the springboard from one to the other. It also feels kind of circular to me, almost like you could watch these in either order and have a different experience in a way. So it's not like it's a sequel and a prequel. There's definitely not a word for that, but it's interesting because they each stand on their own, and then they also each complement each other. But further, technology has changed so much every day, every year, and that gap between them was, maybe this wide, but the gap with technology was even wider. So when you think about process for each, what was the difference technologically? What was easier? What was harder? How was it different making these two films?
It's surprisingly, in some ways, not different at all. In other ways, quite a bit different. Mr. Rogers and Me was absolutely Chris and I together at every shoot. So let's say there are a dozen of them, dozen different characters. Chris is setting up 2 cameras and mics and lights. I mean, I'm helping, but I'm doing what I'm told, right? Chris is sending me basically discs to preview and transcribe, and then I'm arranging and writing a script, and then he's cutting in his Avid in New York City. So that's that. Friends and neighbors, we live, I don't know, 300 miles apart at this point. So him and I shooting everything wasn't feasible. He's got 3 kids over 15. I've got 2 kids, 12 and 14. There was no way we were going to shoot everything together. And I also know working with him is challenging to, get one shot. So I used local videographers for Pennsylvania and Delaware. I used the same young man who I'm playing a rock show with later this afternoon. And I used videographers wherever I went. Things like Otter, which is online transcription, made transcription a piece of cake. I didn't have to pay PAs to do it, so that was easier. I did all the voiceover right here. That made that much easier because I have all the podcasting equipment and good mics and so forth, preamps. I would say a lot more of it, a lot like a lot of the records I've made over the last 2 decades, was more virtual than in person. In other words, like the guy who did the sound mix, we haven't seen each other ever. I used all the assets from the last record I made, just none of my vocals. So all the musicians and music on is from Muscle Shoals from that last record, Constellations. So in some ways, like a lot of it was assembled in the cloud. I'd say that would be the primary difference, and using remote production instead of all of it being Chris and I. But then we shipped the whole thing sort of in blocks up to my brother, who put it all together and polished it. So in some ways, it was a very linear process versus a kind of nonlinear process. And we did use technology really to speed us up, I guess I would say. And to my previous point, we're still working on it. You know what I mean? We'll be tweaking voiceover, and I still owe little bits of correction and update and nuance that I still have to voice. And that would have required us borrowing time from one of his friends in a real live studio in New York City, as opposed to me pulling the Shure mic over to my face and redoing it here. So easier in some ways. We also, it's worth noting, had resources because we didn't earn a ton of money from Mr. Rogers and me, but everything that we earned, let's say, I don't know, 20 grand, we had socked away into an account predicated on the assumption that we would use it to do something else. So that made it easier to move fast and to step it up. I mean, I think you would agree that the production values are improved. And certainly my costuming is improved because I'm not wearing socks jacked up to my knees and shorts and like awful bright colored shirts, because I thought that one through this time, because I'd been to the dance once before.
Well, that's what's funny. Like you said, when you came up through technology, growing up through the 90s, I'm a little bit younger, but I came up through the 90s as well, and was there to see the transition from analog to digital tape, and then from digital tape to just digital files, tapeless, SD cards in the cloud, et cetera, et cetera. And sometimes there's that moment where the story was ahead of the technology, and you look back and you're like, man, if I could tell that story again with the technology, it would look so much better. Yeah. But the technology is so rooted as part of the story. So I have movies I made that are low grade, 4:3 digital video, and like, oh, I wish I had a second chance at that, but that I'm not the same person.
Yeah.
And it's technology grows just like we do. And we figure it out. And so it's always fun to see what it looked like as a manifestation of who we were and what we were feeling at that time.
Yeah, and what we were capable of. So what the technology was capable of and what we were capable of. I mean, I hope the storytelling is more sophisticated. I mean, you're a filmmaker and a professor of film. So we were basically episodic in Mr. Rogers and Me. And in Friends and Neighbors, there's kind of a super tease and a super conclusion, and there's more intercutting. There's a little bit of intercutting in Mr. Rogers and Me, but not as much. So like, I was proud not just of the look and feel, like you've got some nice depth of field and some soft, beautiful lighting and some nice coloring and that sort of thing that wasn't always present in Mr. Rogers' movie. Certainly the Nantucket footage is beautiful. But like the Tim Russert interview, we're clearly in a conference room at NBC in Washington, DC, you know, there's not much you could do with it. Or like, you know, whatever, I won't sidebar into them because there's so many funny stories around like, all right, you got 10 minutes in this random location. This one, we were really able to step some of that stuff up and step up some of the approaches to how we wove it all together. But it was all in abstraction and all from mostly here or at my dining room table via Google Docs, where all was still the master script with all the notes and all the addendums and so forth exists.
Yeah, it's funny to think about the technology and how it's changed, but like you said, it's still storytelling.
Yeah.
That's one thing I emphasize here when I'm talking to students or their parents or prospective students is that the technology changes, but the storytelling doesn't. And, you know, I went here and I learned how to edit on a linear tape to tape machine that I always do the dials. You would jog and mark in and mark out in the beeps. And then my senior year, there was an Avid, and then there was Final Cut, and then there was Premiere. But you learn how to tell stories early on, and then you just use the tech to change it. And I'm really glad to hear somebody else say that. It's still just us telling stories, whether it's with a crayon or a pencil or a pen. It's still what we're communicating through the technology. And I hope that may, you know, now with AI and ChatGPT is that
no one's going to watch it if it's not compelling, right? Like beginning, middle, end. And what I was going to say is I don't want to be too highfalutin, but like I was super conscious of being aware that it's the hero's quest. Like, I mean, once you learn the hero's quest, everything's the hero's quest, right? Like this idea of like, oh, well, I had this sort of epiphany, and then I went out to kind of gain insight and I faced some challenges. And then this is me coming back to the fire, just happens to be of the screen, the flicker of the screen, to share what I've learned. And hopefully the tribe gains insight and we're all a little bit different. I mean, it'd be great if we're all a lot different after watching this one, but you know, I'm kind of taking the wins where I can get them. But yeah, I mean, I felt like I was even more aware of story because I had a little more experience with it.
Yeah, I think quest is a good word for your style. That they're journeys. That there's a traveling element to them, and when you think about how you frame stories, you know, you could do it topically or chronologically. Yours is, I think, a combination of topics, but also space. That it's just almost like Indiana Jones. You should have the line.
It's funny you say that. I thought about that. Yeah, there's a geography to it. And by the way, I credit where it's due. Chris and I, so spoiler alert for those of you who will someday see Friends and Neighbors, it is about understanding PTSD, and the first person to learn about it is me. And we talk to folks who can inform the story of what happened to me, but moreover, the story of what happens in adverse childhood experiences or acute traumas as adults and what the physiological impacts are. So at some point I say to my brother, I think I'm going to get in the car and basically revisit all the spots where stuff was really bad, right? And Chris goes, you know, it would be really messed up, except he didn't say messed. You should interview mom and dad. And I was like, oh, that's the worst, best ever heard. And I'm still super ambivalent about it, but it's hard to imagine it being as effective without having spent, you know, I spent a couple hours with each of them. It's about 15 minutes of a 75-minute movie, which is a pretty unpleasant 15 minutes for me to watch. And I know for them, but there's something universal and super applicable, especially to a certain generation of kids who, you know, 50% of whom her parents didn't stay married. Many of whom were home alone after school to fend for themselves in front of MTV or what have you, right? So hopefully it touches on something obviously more universal. I mean, this is a Fredism. Often what is most personal is most universal. So this was my sort of guiding light as I made this movie, which is like, the truer I can be, the more honest I can be, the more likely it is to connect with people more broadly. And I hope that's the case. I've gotten great feedback. Everyone's like, well, it's about you, but it feels like it's about all of us. And I'm like, that's the idea. That's the idea.
And that's what's really hard is when you start personally, and you
Yeah.
don't know if there's going to be a universal message by the end. I mean, that's the beauty of the documentary form,
Yeah.
is the writing happens in the production.
Yeah.
Like that's something that Ken Burns talks about, is like, we just start shooting.
Yeah.
And then the writing, we discover something, and then you actually kind of write it afterward as you're doing post. And thinking back to the analog days, when you're jogging them, and even film, it was a linear process. You didn't start editing really until you were done shooting, and you didn't start shooting until you were done preparing. And there's certainly a discipline to that. When I talk to my students who never experienced that because of their age, it's like, you were robbed of this because it gave you a discipline of knowing the process, that made the digital transition so easy I think for people like us, is like, wow, the hard part's gone.
Yeah.
And now we can just like embrace the easy part. And sometimes I think that discipline is gone, but like you said, it makes it easier, but also harder, because you don't have the roadmap. You're just driving, you're just running, hoping that by the end, your message is more universal. So I'm glad to hear that
you figure it out. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you can do a lot with writing, and I may have done too much, which is why, to my previous point, I've done some notable revision to the version that you've seen, and certainly anyone will ever see in the future will be notably more efficient and tighter and a little less maudlin. I mean, the other part about this is, in PTSD circles or CPTSD circles, this is referred to as a healing journey, which is a little cornpone or hokey, except it's a real thing, and it is a real journey. And I started shooting Friends and Neighbors pretty quickly after the diagnosis. And a diagnosis isn't a permanent diagnosis. The idea is this is something you can manage and heal and recover from, and sort of find a new way to process the world and be in the world that doesn't say require 6 beers a night, which I'm happy to report I have done, but it was in real time. And so a lot of the writing, I think, was overwriting, and a lot of the VO was overwrought. And so a lot of what I've done in the intervening year since sort of wrapping, we premiered it at the Heartland Film Festival in October of 2023. And we did a bunch of screening for Mental Health Awareness Month in May of 2024, and anticipate a May of 2025 wider release. In that time period, I've not just tightened the language, but sort of removed some of the weight and the maudlin VO, because it doesn't feel as heavy and maudlin to me now. Like, I'm through it. It's really interesting. So it is super real time, at least this one was for me. I'm not even remotely in the same place as I was when I did the first or second interview, which is fascinating. But to your previous point about journey, to end this thesis or end this point, I think the false construct of any documentary is that it has a finite end. Like, I suppose if you're doing a documentary about somebody who's no longer alive, there's an end. But any body of research jammed into 90 minutes or 75 minutes, any narrative is omitting all kinds of things, right? It's like, it's the frame. And so to me, you're just kind of trying to capture some period of time and some body of information, knowing full well that there's a prequel and a sequel, whether or not we make them or you see them. It is an ongoing thing. There's no there. Do you know what I mean? Somebody could make another definitive Mr. Rogers and Me, or Mr. Rogers documentary. There's other ways. I just was listening to NPR last night. This woman wrote a memoir about marrying a man 40 years her senior back in the 70s, and just rewrote the memoir through the lens of Me Too as a 70-some-year-old. So, you know what I'm saying? Like, you can sort of change the camera angle or the scope by stepping back, and still have a whole new interesting version of a story. You don't need to use any of that, but you enjoy it.
No, I hope certainly that we do. It's funny, my kids are 6 3/4. He would want me to make sure that I didn't just say 6. And my daughter is 9, and so obviously a little younger than yours, but Inside Out and Inside Out 2 are very much a part of our lives, and we saw it in the theater just a few weeks ago.
Me too.
And there, you watch that, and it is obviously Pixar's. It's so poignant, and it really speaks to both kids and parents. But something that, as you get older, you realize is how they talk about memories changing. You know, like when they swipe over and it changes color, and what used to be joyful is now sad, and it's nostalgic, and how, you know, or if you keep going, you can see it. And it's like you said, your voiceover is different because you're different. And when you look back on something, it's different now. It's painted differently. It's because of what time can do. And so, yeah, it just, that's what just came to my mind, is just that film and how we process our memories.
Memory is story. And this is what makes healing from trauma possible, because our memories aren't tapes that we play back, exact replicas of what occurred, right? Our memories are the story we tell. And so the whole thing to healing from trauma is to reframe the story for yourself and not be stuck as a 9-year-old under the stairs, you know, hiding away from his parents, having a physically violent domestic dispute, right? Or the 16-year-old whose jaw was broken in a parking lot by a sucker punch from the captain of the football team, right? I can be 50-year-old me going back to 9-year-old me and saying, I know that was scary, but you're okay. We made it. Look, you know, and that's why I love it. The spoiler alert at the end of the movie, when in the animation, adult me goes and helps that 16-year-old me up off the pavement at the Wawa and walks him to safety. And that's what you do in therapy for trauma. You actually revisit the memory in a way that is not as hypersensitive. So you're in essence meditating, or in a guided meditation, or hypnotized. I mean, you're basically bilateral stimulated. So your amygdala is in a much chiller place. And then you go back and you reprocess. You actually put a new patina, to use that sort of like color filter metaphor of Inside Out 2, over the memory so that it doesn't have the same charge. And so like my memory of that, I literally see myself at 16 differently than I did 5 years ago. And that memory of having been sucker punched, because I didn't see that punch coming. I just, one minute I'm eating Twizzlers with my girlfriend, and the next minute I got a broken jaw and I'm unconscious and I'm spitting blood all over the place. And I think I'm going to die because I've never had a blunt force trauma to the head, you know, and I'm 16 and nobody's doing anything. Everyone's like, well, what do we do? You know, I'm like, hospital, you know, but it doesn't come with the same charge. And so it really is fascinating how, you know, to look at film and story and to realize that in a lot of ways, all we are ever doing is playing a projector in our head of a story. This is my story about me and the world. And today I'm talking to David on his TV show, right? And we can retell the story and bring ourselves to a safe place. And that is the whole point of healing from trauma. And it sounds maybe, I don't know, esoteric, or I always feel like this stuff sounds a little hippy dippy, frankly, because I was raised at a time when all this stuff sounded hippy dippy and I was pretty suspicious. But I can tell you it works, and it worked. And, you know, normally when I would have told that story, as I just did, my heartbeat would have spiked and my blood pressure would have increased and I'd gotten a little hot right here. I don't know, didn't feel that way this time. So it's pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's funny. Recently, someone asked me if I watch these shows, and I said I didn't. Like, because I experienced them, and there's something about watching myself talking that feels uncomfortable now. But I do imagine watching these in a couple years.
Yeah.
Just because it's like, oh, that's what I looked like, what I sounded like, who I was talking to. That was the space I was in. My kids are older. My life is different. So it's like you said, our memories now are documented. This here will become a memory for us.
This we can play back.
Yes, exactly. That's the beauty of the camera and the recording, is that.
But it won't be the same in a decade for you. All right. It's stuff like to dig into. And it's all in essence story, which is certainly something that connects us, and certainly something that Fred understood well. I mean, the world, the land of make-believe, right? The neighborhood, that was all about like finding a safe place to explore things that sometimes were unsafe. I mean, Fred was talking about divorce like in the film, I used to get shuttled between my parents, and it was really a terrible feeling. And Fred was talking about it in like 1980. The special he did with Linda Ellerby that I excerpt in the movie is actually the same month my parents told us they were getting divorced. So this guy was so ahead. It's bananas. And the fact that I got to meet him for a couple of afternoons and exchange a couple letters, and right over there I have a little book that he signed for me and that kind of thing, is like, what a gift. Like, and that's where you arrive if you do your due diligence with PTSD, hopefully, as you get to this place where you're like, wow, what a miracle. This is all a miracle. And that was terrible, but I'm here and I'm raising my own daughters through a whole different lens. And hopefully by doing this sort of thing with you and others, we can help other people too. So I don't know, I just feel like there's a little bit of a pay it forward. Like Fred was handing batons out all over the place, all over the place.
Well, I'm reminded of the fact that this actually is a show that we're doing. The conversation has been, I love the conversation, and I think we probably could go until we're both hoarse, but I do think we should be mindful of the time and maybe a wrap up. And as anybody who's watched the show knows, I like to end by having a questionnaire to the guest, to the filmmaker, about their connection to films. So I want to jump into those right now with you. So I like to start with, what movie makes you laugh?
There aren't a lot of movies I return to, but the two that make me laugh the most, that I've returned to most consistently, are both Rob Reiner films, which I suspect doesn't surprise you, nor will what they are. Princess Bride and This Is Spinal Tap, kind of on repeat.
So yeah, this is Spinal Tap, also a documentary. So I think there's a bridge there. All right. So what movie makes you cry?
So the film that makes me cry, again, I'm going to give you two answers, but both by the same filmmaker, and both interestingly from a similar period of time. Terms of Endearment. I remember seeing that after my parents' divorce, and I literally just felt tears well up in me just saying that. It made me so sad. That feeling of grief at the end, that loss, it was so real for me. And Broadcast News, which I saw shortly thereafter, a couple of years later, I feel like. It's similar. There's a sense of loss at the end, right? He ties it up in a slightly tidier bow, if you recall, as I recall. But there's a different kind of loss. There's like this loss of like values. And as it ends up, it came to inform. I mean, if I had $1 for how many times I would refer to that movie at work, I would have many extra bucks in my pocket. That bit at the beginning when she's like, shows the dominoes and everybody cheers because that's the story they want to watch, is the kids who set up a gymnasium full of dominoes and nobody wants to watch the hard-hitting reportage. I was like, this feels relevant.
Yep. All right. So next, what movie scares you?
I'm not a big scary movie guy, which I bet doesn't surprise you, having seen Friends and Neighbors.
I'm not either.
And I have a weird answer for you. But because it's actually a movie that was made to be funny. And I think most of it I thought was funny. But when I reflect on the question, I think of the movie Toxic Avenger, which again is a comedy. And when I moved to Hell's Kitchen, New York City, Troma Pictures offices were there. And I was so excited. And I loved that I knew such a weird art house kind of like B movie when I was a teenager. But there's a scene in it that haunts me to this day that I'm sure somebody who was doing like rudimentary makeup and effects was just practicing their craft with. But a kid's riding a bike and gets hit by a car, and the car runs over the kid's head and the head splatters everywhere. And it is the most disturbing image I've ever seen. I hate it. So that scares me, and it would scare me as a dad, right?
Yeah.
Scares me to death. And you can cut all that out and just use the title if you want.
Well, I know for me, a lot of documentaries scare me. I mean, reality can be scary. So I do not watch horror movies. I do not want to be scared because life is scary enough.
That is literally what I say to people when they're like, you want to go see what was Silent, whatever the movie about where the aliens kill people if you make noise. I'm like, no, I'm good. And that's not even practically sci-fi, but like, no. Yeah. Don't need a jump scare. Like that was 0 to 18. I'm good.
Yeah, me too. All right. Finally, what movie inspires you?
I feel like I have to give credit where it's due for possibly the most significant inspiration of at least my creative career as a filmmaker, which would be Michael Moore's Roger and Me. Like it just was like a template that I was like, oh, I can do that. I would add Clerks, and I've had some little bitty conversations with Kevin Smith's people about screening at his theater, because Kevin came out a few years ago to talk about his own experience with trauma and the impact that's had on him, which I thought was huge. And knock on wood, we'll get a screening with him.
That'd be great.
But Clerks was also a movie where literally Chris and I walked out of the theater together, and I was like, Chris, we can totally do this.
Yes.
Totally. I was like, and I'd seen Hollywood Shuffle, which you may recall, another movie made on credit cards. I'd seen She's Gotta Have It. And I was like, this is the asset of working at a video store as a kid. And I was like, we have to make our own movies. What are we doing, man? It's our time, So
Swingers. It was Swingers for me. I was like,
yes, similar, totally right.
Okay, well, thank you for being here. I think it's time to wrap it up, but I do think having you as a guest really makes our conclusion pretty obvious, that we should really channel our inner Freds. And when we wrap up, I have my phone so I can watch the time. I think it would be good for us and our audience to just take 10 seconds to think about people we love, people who loved us into loving, loved us into being, and it can be anybody we want. So let's just take the next 10 seconds for some silence. I'll watch the clock. Thank you, Ben. It was a pleasure talking to you. I hope we can do this again, maybe have you to my class and see you in this form sometime in the future.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, that wraps it up for today. Thank you for watching. And as always, we will see you next time.
Mr. Rogers summered in a modest gray clapboard house on the edge of Nantucket Island. My family rented a tiny cottage next door. On the afternoon of my 30th birthday, Mr. Rogers asked me about my job as an MTV producer. Moments later, the man with the longest-running public television program in history said to me, "I feel so strongly that deep and simple is far more essential than shallow and complex." The conversation haunted me for years, and though Mr. Rogers wasn't around to tell me in his own words, I wondered, who was he really, and what did he mean by deep and simple? And so I left my Times Square office and sought out the neighbors that knew and loved him best.
Mr. Rogers was a unique human being, forever giving, forever teaching, forever nurturing, forever taking advantage of every moment to tell people that it is important that we respect one another and love one another. What a lasting legacy.
He would walk into a room, an atmosphere where there were children, but not only children, because adults reacted this way to him as well. And the electricity, the molecules changed in the air. You felt that you were in the presence of this figure.
He used his life so well and so wisely, and he used his time on earth to do so much good. It was just what he was here to do. And he did it so effortlessly.
He assumed that everyone watching him had inside themselves this wonderful person that was just dying to get out. And he was going to open the door for you. And then help you open the door for others. That's pretty simple, and that's pretty deep.
Mr. Rogers touched millions of lives. This is the story of Mr. Rogers and me.